Hello, everyone. Again, good evening. Welcome you all to yet another session of Skywatchers Association. Believe it or not, we are really missing you. We are missing you being with you on the field with the telescopes in our hands. We are missing it for a pretty long time. So, to be in touch, we do organize these webinars or seminars, whatever you call it. It is just with the intention that we believe in one thing. We believe in sharing our knowledge. So whatever we learn, whatever we are about to learn, whatever we have learned, we try to share it with all of you. So all of you are welcome to yet another session from Skywatchers Association. Now, apart from the previous sessions we had, this one is something different. That is, the Mangalyaan or the Chandrayans, we believe were not built in one day. The long years of devotion, perseverance, and all the effort that hundreds of people put into it made these missions successful. Now, looking through a telescope, looking into the skies could be looking back in time. But the history of Indian astronomy, it's so enriching. It basically tells us where we stand today and how we have come to this spot today. Like Martin Luther King has once said, we are not makers of history, we are made by history. Now, if we don't know the efforts of those people who put in those efforts previously in the historical past or the near past, we won't know where we are going to move on into the future tomorrow. Again, we are made by history, but we are not makers of history. Makers of history can be twisted a bit. What we do today becomes the history for tomorrow. So to know the present and to know the road that we will be walking into, knowing the past is very essential. So today we have a session on the astronomers of India of the 19th century, a beautiful presentation by Dr. Nandivada Ratnasri, who is the director of the Nehru Planetarium. She will be the presenter today. Not going any further, I'm handing over the platform to Dipankar to take you through the next part of the program. Dipankar.
Thank you, Shaibad sir, for a wonderful welcome address to Dr. Ratnasri madam. As we are today, will look back at history, not just a year, because this year is going to end in just 1 or 2 days, but we shall look back way back in 19th century to know about the Indian astronomers that sir have already mentioned, and to know about the then Indian astronomers, and to deliver the lecture and the talk about them, we are fortunate enough to have Dr. N. Ratnasri amongst us. Dr. Ratnasri is the director of the Nehru Planetarium, Delhi, and she is in this chair for almost 2 decades. She is an renowned educator and works for the outreach of astronomy. She also have done some research on archaeoastronomy. She have a doctorate in theoretical physics from the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research on massive star evolution in binary systems. Her postdoctoral work was in the field of radio pulsar studies. And without any further ado, because every one of us is waiting for Madam to deliver the talk, it is our absolute honor and privilege to request Dr. Ratnasri to take charge of the session and deliver her talk. Madam, if you please take charge of the session. Welcome, Madam.
Thank you, Dipankar and Saikatji and the Skywatcher Association for asking me to uh, talk to all of you. I picked up just off my head at that time. I picked up a topic which I was very interested in, and that is the topic I'd like to share with all of you. But I think I need to mention a little bit, put it in perspective, in the sense that if you look at that time, a period of about 100 years, and I've actually put a little bit of prothalmion and epithalmion. If you look at that period, those were colonial times, and India became a location of choice when there were certain astronomical events, eclipses, transits, and so on. And so there were presence of a large group of astronomers with very sophisticated equipment and so on, who traveled halfway across the world to come to India and observe. And these endeavors have been looked at quite in detail, and in a sense it has been considered that um, some of these events, like the 18th century and the 19th century transits of Venus, and the Great Trigonometrical Survey of India, as having in a way laid the path towards modern astronomy in India. And if we look back in time, we have the Siddhantic astronomy, which was very strong mathematical astronomy for mm, positional astronomy, and the Zij astronomy following that for several hundred years again, let's say maybe after 10th century AD to the times we are talking of, which had again positional astronomy in the form of observations and tabulations and how to find out events happening ahead and so on, all of this in Zijes. So there were these two streams of astronomy, sometimes coming together and sometimes going into different endeavors. And it is not that in a way that the slate was wiped clean and then we had modern astronomy getting in a way into the country. It was not like that. These two streams of astronomy continued. There were a number of people who had these interests. Either they may have been Siddhantic astronomers, or they followed the Zij um, framework for their astronomical endeavors. And then some of them did get influenced by the modern telescopes and modern kind of equipments. So we have, as you can see, I put a map here, and I am mainly going to be using the map to walk you through some of the 19th century astronomical endeavors. So these endeavors would be could be astronomers, as we now call astronomers, people who actually undertook the practice of astronomy with equipment, made observations, published them, and so on. So it could be astronomers. It could be some amateur astronomers who undertook some practice of astronomy. It could be instrument makers, and it could be almanac makers. All of them, in a way, undertook some astronomical endeavors. So it is these that I would like to uh, walk you through. And so, to walk this through, as I was saying, I have a bit of a prologue and a bit of an epilogue of these. So, we actually go a little bit earlier than the 19th century that we are talking about, and we come to the Jantar Mantar Observatory in Delhi. You may say Jantar Mantar Observatory is early 18th century. Why are we bringing that in this? Well, there is a very surprising continuity going on into 18th century from this. In general, these observatory, if you, for instance, if you see this image here, so they are generally been considered that once the creator of these observatories passed away, they kind of fell into disuse. Yes, they were in fact ravaged and so on. We can see in this photograph. This may not have been of those times, early 18th century, which I am talking of, but time and again, this observatory maybe went into disuse and perhaps was repaired and so on. But I want to take you to a little bit of a story connected with this observatory. So we have the Jantar Mantar observatory here, and Sawai Jai Singh had built it. He had an astronomer working with him who was in fact in charge of the observatory, and Khairullah Mudnis, he was in charge of the observatory. He had a pupil, Musharraf Khan, and Musharraf Khan's son was Mubashir Khan. And so they were situated in Delhi. Mubashir Khan was an almanac maker, and uh, Mubashir Khan was an almanac maker. He had a daughter. Daughter's name was Badsha Begum, and she was his favorite daughter. And uh, now I will come to actually how we get to know about her. We get to know about her because she's one of the rare um, women characters in history who has a tariq written for her. So there is a tariq e Badsha Begum which was written by a contemporary of hers, and the reference I have for this is actually from primary sources. So there is Tariq-e Badsha Begum, which was written by Abdul Ahad, and in 1938 or so, Muhammad Taqi Ahmad translated it into English. And this actually, there is just one line of it. But this is so surprising that I want to use this as my starting point for talking about astronomical endeavors in 18th century India. And in fact this starts with late 18th century and going on to 19th century. So Badsha Begum was actually taught the practice of astronomy. Her biographer, who is not at all sympathetic to her, says that her father taught her the theory and practice of astronomy. Her father was an almanac maker, presumably was using the Jantar Mantar observatory at Delhi, and he taught her the practice of it. So just I'm imagining here is one character, young girl, who was perhaps proficient in use of the Jantar Mantar observatory instruments. And she, around 1799 or so, she was married to who became later Ghiyasuddin Haidar, our kings. So she moved to Lucknow, Badsha Begum. So this is all we know about her astronomy endeavors. And so her life was then spent here. This is the Chatar Manzil and the Farad Baksh Palace over there. And she actually innovated a number of religious practices. And so that it's not of relevance to us those. However, one part of it consisted of at the birth of imams, a ceremony called Sitara Bini, wherein people would actually go sit out in open and look up at the stars. So she was definitely what we would call an amateur astronomer with a keen interest in astronomy, and her interest in astronomy perhaps also passed on to her stepson, and we will talk of him a little later. So this is I'm trying to move a little bit chronologically because it may not always be so. So that's the first connection I wanted to make. Badsha Begum of Lucknow, of course, we would not call her an astronomer, but definitely we could call her an amateur astronomer, someone with a keen interest in astronomy. Then maybe we move. Of course, if we are doing chronologically, we should go to the Madras Observatory. Now, Madras Observatory, there are a number of very many number of references which I've used to put together whatever I wanted to talk to you about. So from all of that, and once again I'm not going into the details of the setting up of the observatory, the endeavors by the British astronomers in the observatory and so on. I would just like to look up a little bit about the Indian astronomers who were part of the observatory. And of course, the most well known name is Chintamani Raghunadachari. I will come to him a little later because I'm going chronologically. He's here in this photograph. But that's Madras Observatory a little later. Very early on, it was a much smaller building. And yeah, here is a visual from the observatory. I will try to show a larger picture wherein we can see one of the British astronomers and two Indian assistants. So they were assistants there. And In this talk of mine, I'm just trying to look at the kind of astronomical activities which had been taken up by Indian astronomers all along. So among these assistants, several names are mentioned, although their actual activity is not totally known. Chintamani Raghunadachari, yes, we know. One other assistant who was there in the observatory was someone called Gode Jaggarao. He came from um, Vizag, and from a kind of a zamindari family. And we will talk about the observatory set up in Vizag later. But at a very young age, he came to Chennai. He had a lot of interest in astronomy. He joined as an assistant when Taylor was one of the government astronomers in the Madras Observatory. And uh, he undertook he was very very keen, and he started learning about this from a very young age. And he assisted when Halley's comet came in 1835 or so. He assisted the government astronomer at that time, and it is mentioned in the publication about the Halley's comet. And he also undertook calculations for occultations of the moon. At that time, the moon culminating stars were not all that well compiled together. So he did work on that. He did work, presumably, the work at Madras Observatory going on was in terms of very accurate positions for stars. That was one long running work there, and several observations of occultations and so on, and Jupiter satellite events. All of these he must have had participated, and he did one work. He tried to estimate the mass of Jupiter by the observations of the satellites and application of Kepler's laws and so on. And this got published under his name. So these were the astronomical endeavors of Gode Jaggarao. And then he moved back to Vishakhapatnam, and he set up an observatory there. And the observatory work is much more known through the works of Ankitam Venkata Narsingh Rao, who was his son in law. So, this observatory was set up called the Daba Gardens Observatory. Currently, the Dolphin Hotel is situated there in Vishakhapatnam. And this was essentially entirely a private enterprise. And Gode Jaggarao also tried to get telescopes into the observatory. Unfortunately, he passed away before that was done. And but his son-in-law, Ankitam Venkata Narsingh Rao, he left it to his daughter and son-in-law. This observatory, he took it up, and we will perhaps talk about that effort a little later, because we are going chronologically. So that was Gode Jaggarao at the Madras Observatory. We then come to now, these here are instances. We had two very disparate instances. One of Badsha Begum, who was learning in the traditional school, remained in the traditional school, did not get opportunity, of course, to really explore what she may have had done. And from a zamindari family, people who actually had all the resources and so on to build up their own observatory and contribute through their observations and publications and so on. We'll see the large amount of work which Ankitam Venkata Narsingh Rao did. Then we again come to a traditional astronomer, Bapu Deva Sastri from Benares, and he taught in what was then the Queen's College in Benares. I'm using all the terms of those days because we are walking through the 19th century. So here we have a view of him teaching in the Queen's College. We can see a celestial sphere there, and so he actually taught astronomy as a course over there. He also wrote a book about the Varanasi Manmandir Observatory. So that's Papudeva Shastri. So in the traditional format, he worked over there in Banaras. And then let me move on this map here. Here we come across someone who actually I have not marked out all the places he moved in, but he was a Molana and a teacher in a school in Tekari, Gaya. where a king actually had set up. In fact, in these regions, this was the one place, one location where educational institutions, printing press, and also both Western as well as Indian education together was being provided. And here was a teacher, Ghulam Hussain Jaunpuri, and he actually wrote several works on astronomy. And then I have obtained all the information about it from several resources, Professor Razaullah Ansari, Khan Gori, and Professor Ramesh Kapoor. Oh, before I actually started altogether, I wanted to put out another reference, flash one reference, which was to say that overall, all the information I have got, I am not able to pick it up here right now. Uh, So, Professor Kochar, Professor Razaullah Ansari, and Maulana Khan Gori, mainly from their writings, most of the information which I have. And then specific instances, I am just showing, like for instance, in the case of John Puri, the most recent and exhaustive information about his efforts from Professor Ramesh Kapoor, which was recently published in Current Science. And what was it that he did? He was a teacher who wrote several treatises on astronomy, mostly classical, the Zij kind of a framework he worked on. And here is actually what I flashed here is one page from his Zij Bahadur Khani. Bahadur Khan was one of the sons of the king who, I think, who gave him a lot of support. So a lot of his work is named after Bahadur Khan. So this is Vijay Bahadur Khan. You know, the funny thing, I just saw it on internet yesterday that this is being sold. This has been sold for about 6,000 pounds as a 16th century manuscript. It is a 19th century manuscript, and so this Z.J. Bahadur Khani mentions several interesting aspects, observations which he must have had done. uh, Ghulam Hussain Jaunpure. And what are these observations? One very interesting observation is that of a comet, um, which he undertook in 1825. And Professor Kapoor actually deduces that it was the fourth of the comets in that year which was observed. And he observed it for a few days. He observed that the tail of the comet was more towards the sun, and he saw its motion for about 5 degrees, its motion in the sky. He observed that. So perhaps these were all naked eye observations. However, he also observed some of the minor planets, which at that time they were just getting renamed as asteroids. They were thought of to be as more other planets. So Sirius, Vesta, Pallas. So he definitely had, access in some way to a telescope. He made observations of these, and he had several European friends with similar interests, from whom he got to know about the more modern context of astronomy. He did not know English, so it was while interacting with these friends that he got to know of this. So he has made some of these observations. So that was John Pure, and. I may have had left out some interesting aspects. I'll come back. Putting together so many different astronomy endeavors, perhaps I'm not really doing justice to any one of them. But this is kind of like we are taking an overview, overall view. So there was also, of course, another observatory which was set up in Trivandrum. This is now relatively well known. There was this wonderful movie which has been made about it, an award winning film which was made about it. Swati Tirunal, Ravi Verma, he was the king here in Travancore, and he talked to a few British astronomers, and it was they who set up the observatory. Now, here I just want to pause a little and talk about several of these observatories which came up at this time. Uh, Several of these observatories which came up around this time. Madras Observatory, of course, it was purely a government initiative which came up at that time. And then we talked about the private observatory which was uh, the Daba Gardens Observatory. And then we have the Travancore Observatory, which was also a private enterprise, and it got in several uh, British astronomers, and then the observatory was set up with very fine instruments. So also is another observatory. We'll come to that after this. And in this observatory also, a large number of these instruments were set up, and work was for essentially those days. One of the important work would have been positions of stars and so on to complete the all the positions. That would be one work which was being taken up, and then several celestial events which would be coming up. And however, after a while, the observatory again went into disuse. One very poignant story of such an observatory, and again, this is, I think, quite well known. And so the references which I have for this have been once again Professor Kochar, Razaul Ansari, and then some primary sources, which is from Springer, Professor Springer, who was the principal of the Delhi at that time, Delhi College, contemporary to this, and a number of government papers in the National Archives. By looking at all of this, uh, there is this beautiful monument which is still existing, and which was part of course, Lucknow, as we saw, is something which is filled with simply beautiful monuments and which are still surviving. So this was the Chetar Manzil and the Farad Baksh. When I talked about the Badsha Begum, I showed this. Here is one. This is called, this building was called at that time Tarewali Koti. Tarewali Koti. And in this building was set up an observatory. And this observatory was set up with the finest instruments at that time. It had better than the Madras Observatory, as good as the Greenwich Observatory instruments. This observatory was set up. Why was this set up? And this was set up actually by, the initiative for this came from none other than the stepson of Badsha Begum. Badsha Begum, Ghiyasuddin Haidar's son through one of her maids. So Nasiruddin Haidar, and he was adopted by Badsha Begum, and she brought him up with a lot of love and care. Although it is alleged that she killed his mother. Those were the time, kind of violent, disturbing times which were there at that time. Badsha Begum, in general, has one aspect of her is what every historian looks at about these turbulent times, how she was in the political intrigue of who will be the next heir and so on. And Nasiruddin Haidar, when he died, she British took over Oudh, and but she marched to the palace with a person who she said was son of Nasiruddin Haidar, Munna Jan. So if you look back in history, this is what is emphasized about Badsha Begum. Of course, it was just one line about her having thorough knowledge of the theory and practice of astronomy, which I saw in her biography, which set me on her trail. But I have tried to look for any other corroboration of her astronomical endeavors, so which I could not yet unearth. Perhaps, I mean, someone of you interested, we work together and try to find out more. And except for her stargazing as part of the religious practices, but she must have had passed on her interest in astronomy to her stepson Nasiruddin Haidar, who also had enough interest in astronomy. Nasiruddin Haidar, in a way, is maligned in history. Well, maybe there were reasons, good reasons also for that. He was, I mean, supposed to be kind of a dilettante, womanizer, and though those are the kind of stories which are told about him. However, in the context of his endeavor to build the observatory in Lucknow, he wrote to the then Governor General saying that, and he was very generous in this. He's saying that I want that such an observatory should be set up. I want that it should have the finest instruments, and I want that the observatory should give a place to all in world endeavors by doing astronomy research. But I also want that this observatory should actually teach astronomy to our local lads. They should be able to learn astronomy here. The observatory should publish books, translations, and so on. All of this he has written to the Governor General. And but he still looked upon as this observatory was a kind of, just some dilettante kind of endeavor of his. But it may not have been. He did have an interest in astronomy. He wanted all of this, and he was very generous. And when the first observer for that, director for that, he was given very generous salary, and but he when he died, his wife was also given pension by him, and then he got another man of very good caliber, so Wilcox, and then he was in charge of the observatory. The poignant aspect of this Tarewali Koti observatory is that all the work which was done there never got published. So there must have been considerable amount of work done again in the positions of stars in many celestial events. Wilcox at one time he writes saying that I have done some occultation observations, but not all occultations have been followed up. And he says that he left most of these observations, the actual observations, to the boys in the observatory, who were the Indian observers in the observatory, and particularly the star position calculations, and so on. And so some names are mentioned. I had come across it at one reference, but unfortunately for today's talk I could not pull it out. So here I would like to contrast this endeavor with the Madras one. Taylor writes that whenever there were meridian kind of observations, he always left it to the assistants, Indian observers. But off meridian observations he did himself, and he also rechecked and so on. So he did not allow. However, they did come about a lot of independent work from observers there. Here, of course, the observatory was there from 1831 till about 1847 or so, when it was abolished. It was abolished by Wajid Ali Shah, who was followed after one other king, and then Wajid Ali Shah. Nasiruddin Haidar died, and Wajid Ali Shah said that, look, this observatory is not giving any kind of benefit to our Indian lads. It's not doing what we thought it would do, which is to teach them and make them more come into this field. And he abolished the observatory. He says it's benefiting only the British astronomy, and he abolished it. And this also is looked at a little bit critically, and it is also said, and this Springer writes, actually Springer, the Delhi College principal, he writes that there was one Kamaluddin Haidar who was a munshi in the observatory, and he wrote a little bit of history of the observatory, but he wrote something which was not very whatever. It is a little critical of Wajid Ali Shah, and therefore he abolished it. But presumably the reason which is stated, that this is not giving benefit to Indian observers, Indian learners, maybe that may also have had been. Similarly, when Nasiruddin Haidar set it up, he did have very laudable purpose for which it was. However, the poignant fact is that the observatory was shut down, and in 1857, at that time, it was of course ransacked. It was also later on used by some of the mutineers as a location to meet, and so on. And then nothing was found there. Springer from Delhi College tried very hard to get the work done there, get it out and published, but everything was lost. So there are several such poignant stories which happened at that time. Hmm. And then, of course, there is also this, which is the great arc, the great trigonometrical survey, which started just towards the end of 18th century and started from down south. And it was partly astronomy and a large part surveying, which led to this making up of the geodesic survey of the Indian subcontinent. And as a part of it, the assistants who were there, who would not be mentioned so much in many of the work there, but they must have had done a lot of the work here. And two assistants are actually mentioned. One assistant of Everest, Mir Mohsin from Arcot, and he became a very good instruments. He was very good with instruments, and when some theodolites and telescopes were damaged, he actually did the repairs for these. And so initially there was a British instrument specialist who was called, but later on Mir Mohsin was the instrument maintenance for Everest. And of course there is one other person very well known, and that is, let me go to the map now, also part of the survey. And in the map we have, what's the time? Okay, I still have a little good amount of time. So these circles which I have are my epithalamion, which is post, actually just past 19th century. But we have here, I think this is Radhanath Sikdar. Name is now, I think, very well known, and people attribute the finding of the fact that Mount Everest is the tallest mountain to his endeavors. He was not part of the team who was doing the near in the Himalayan survey. He was in the Calcutta office of the survey office, and he was in a way he was looking at reducing of the data and so on. Although the mm, this particular data, which finally led to naming of the Mount Everest, was done from Dehradun office, but he was also he presumably he was the person who actually first. Uh, Unfortunately, I have not written down my reference here, but this was from reference of paper A.K. Chakravarti, I think, who has done a very thorough look at this. I did not make a slide showing the reference, so apologies for that. But so he says that presumably he was the first to initially mention, I mean, look at the initial reductions and point out that this was the tallest peak. And then, of course, the work was continued at the Dehradun office, and Mount Everest got named. Uh, I think this was going a little back in time. There was Pratap Chandra Ghosh, Asiatic Society librarian in Calcutta, and for a while he was, and uh, he was also in a way into an almanac reforming zeal. So what happens with calendars, as you all know, is that calendars we have, when we are looking at astronomical measures for calendar, we have periodicities of the moon and periodicities of the earth going around the sun and so on, several of these periodicities which are incommensurate, plus we have ways of putting these together with our civil kind of a calendar. And everybody is aware that they are periodically corrected, all these corrections of the adhika maas and leap year and so on. So these corrections, and we know that Panchang, for instance, in India from different locations have been having these corrections all along. And so there are various, like regional differences which are still existing that we know. So reforming of the calendars was something which has been ongoing. uh, Jaising his endeavor was one of those. Several people who looked at it all along, this was the endeavor. So here we have this librarian Pratap Chandra Ghosh from Asiatic Society, who was in so this again I have not put the reference slide. So AK Chakravarti, in his paper I had come across this mention of this. And okay, I'll go to the other reference later, because this is post, almost going into 20th century. So I think now I should move to some of the eclipse observations which happened. Once again, as I was mentioning, that this is about endeavors of Indian observers, or the theoretical endeavors, or instrument endeavors and so on. So I have not actually put in some of the great excitements which were there, like the 1868 eclipse. I only just glancingly put it in, and all the transits of Venus, because looking at the endeavors which have been made by Indian observers. So 1868 of the 1868, the solar eclipse, which people from world over came to India. Um, and of course, Guntur is the most famous location. Looks like I've not added a marker. I have to add a marker for that. And and Biman Nath, in his Astronomers universe, he has thoroughly dealt with all aspects of this. And once again, a little bit of an idea about what were the experiences of the Indian observers from there is something perhaps we a little bit is there in his work, but um, I have not. put it in here because I was looking at mainly works of, for instance, Chintaman Raghunatachari, who was given independent work of going for this observation. Unfortunately, he was clouded out, and he only talked about the darkness which ensured, and so on. He made those observations, and then he was also there in another eclipse, 1871 eclipse. Where was he? He was much further south. He was here in Avinashi, Coimbatore. And here he was successful. He made successful observations of that. He also actually published once. This would be of interest to amateur astronomers for sure. He had one publication which talked about um, the personal equation when we are actually trying to observe the eclipse through projection. So that is one paper which is there, which oh, sorry, I should have had kept this like this when I went to this. And then, of course, Chintamani Raghunatachari, his the most well-known aspect of his work is that he actually observed a variable star or reticuli, I think that is the star, and actually that again refers to yet another Indian observer, Muthuswami Pillai, I think. So the observations were done between them, and when one of them was observing, it wasn't observed, and then it was observed later. The variability was then quantified, observed by Raghunatachari. And he, another aspect of his endeavors, which is actually very inspiring for us, was that he not only was kind of part of this government observatory efforts, he, outside of that, he tried to spread the word. He tried to spread the word in several languages. I don't seem to be having a photograph to show that, but during the eclipses, 1868, 1871 eclipse, during the transits of Venus, he got out number of publications in several languages: Kannada, Telugu, Urdu, and Tamil, I think, and maybe several languages. He brought out publications to spread the word, to let people know. And he definitely would have been one who came from an interest in astronomy and a little bit of traditional training, but then he joined the Madras Observatory and he learned several of the modern methods too. And so that was Chintamani Raghunatachari. He in fact wanted to bring out, he wanted that there should be an observatory made by local efforts. I don't know if I have any. However, this could not happen before he passed away. So that's Chintamani Raghunatachari. And here again, there were several references uh, from where I put together all of this information. And I don't seem to have imported that slide, but from a paper of Vagishwari, Kameshwar Rao, Krishna Badi, from there's in work also of Shailaja and TV Venkateswaran, and before that, of course, mentions in works of Professor Kochar and Razaullah Ansari, all of this. So it's something which has been explored a lot, his endeavors. Okay, so let's see where else we are going in the map now. Uh, okay, so this is, of course, this is the Guntur location. Oh, this is the Chintamani Raghunatachari. Okay, so I think we should, now that we have talked about the eclipses of 1868, 1871, we can also come to the eclipse of 1898. But before that, we talk about one endeavor from 19th century India which moved substantially into the modern directions by actually bringing in spectroscopic observations. And so this was by Nigamwala, he was teaching in Elphinstone College, then moved to Pune, the engineering college there, and his abilities and work was so impressive that this building up of observatory and his endeavors were encouraged by Lockyer, and he in fact undertook a number of observations with very a 20-inch telescope and a spectroscope, really again quite world class equipment at that time, was actually bought to this observatory by Nigamwala. And there was a grant given by Maharaja Takhat Singh Ji of Bhavnagar, and which started this observatory. And a lot of spectroscopic work was done there. Observations of the Orion Nebula and spectral lines from that, some novae, and mm, uh, 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 I mean, I am misremembering now, but a good amount of spectroscopic work which was done there. And then there was this eclipse in 1898, for which the one strong Indian team was Nigamwala's team in Jir, January 1898. Let's take a look at this view. So that's their equipment, and so it was like there was a heliostat, and then there was a photoheliograph here, and uh, in this eclipse, actually the flash spectrum was also actually imaged. Here is the composite image obtained for the eclipse from Nigamwala's team, and the flash spectrum which was also obtained through the spectroscopic observations at that time. And so this is one effort which was really very very in modern directions. However, when Nigamwala retired, the equipment then was all moved perhaps by the government to Madras Observatory and so on. I talked about the survey, right? Great Trigonometrical Survey. I just wanted to also share this one view, which is actually from Fillmore's publication on the history of the Trigonometrical Survey. So, several of the theodolites, the camp doing the observation. The trigonometrical survey was done under really very, very kind of, like going through all of those. If we actually read the great arc, the kind of conditions under which this was being undertaken, it's one really very heroic effort. And in this, once again, we talked of two Indian observers who took part in it quite substantially. So that was this. Then did we? Oh yeah, I did not quite. Before going to Nigamwala, I should perhaps have had come back to this Daba Gardens of Vishakhapatnam, and this observatory which we talked about how Gode Jagarao had set it up, and then uh, he left it to his daughter and son-in-law, and this was Ankitam Venkata Narasimha, who actually took it up very rigorously. After that, the telescope was bought in, and it was barely, I think, about 6 inch or so. And later on, there was also an effort to do photographic work of stars from this observatory. And in fact, I wanted to talk about it last of all, but I'll do it now. Ankita Venkat Narasimha Rao, while he took up the responsibility of the observatory, he undertook a number of observations. So there were comet observations, and there were, he took up some Jupiter observations, of Jupiter red spot observation. His language is really very musical when he is describing, and in fact, many astronomers, when we actually read what they have observed and so on, before actually they started using photography, it's so lyrical, the descriptions. And he at one time he talks of the comet tail as an elephant's tusk. And I'm just not able to recall it off my head right now, but it's really very lyrical. If there is time towards the end, I'll try to pull out a few of the passages. He observed transit of Mercury, he observed transit of Venus, and all of this work again, I was using the reference. One was my own work, and one was, of course, from the work of Kameshwarao Vageshwari Krishna Badi team. And work was his comparison of his transit of Venus observations in 1874. So he observed all of these, and he was one of the few, I think, from that time who rigorously published this. There are many monthly notice publications of his. All of these which I mentioned have been published in monthly notices. And then he set out to actually put in photographic work there, but he again passed away. Before that, his wife, Ankitam Achutama, she tried to have it continued, this photographic work there. And at one point, the observatory was handed over to the government, then again came back to, I think, their son, and then finally went out of use. So, all right. So that's mm, which is left out. Of course, we come to Odisha, the last of the great Siddhantic astronomers in India. Pathani Samanta Chandrasekhar, who was given the Upadhi of Pathani, and from Khandapada in Orissa. And unlike the Ankita Venkat Narasimha Rao, or the Lucknow or the Travancore, which had some kind of zamindari or kingly support, he was very poor, and he essentially, with his own handmade instruments, he made measurements with very simple handmade instruments. So, as there are a number of yantras which he has actually discussed in his Siddhanta Darpana, was his entire astronomical endeavor which was pulled out. And out of these, like his knowledge of theoretical astronomy and his skill observing very simple instruments. In fact, that is what led us recently to do this Samanta Chandrasekhar challenge for the Jupiter and Saturn conjunction with a simple kind of a cross staff, and quite good results have been obtained by the participants in this. And the inspiration came from Samanta Chandrasekhar, and he actually, then he obtained the sidereal periods and inclinations of orbits and so on, and remarkably accurate, and in some cases, one or two cases, more accurate than the European value at that time. And this is there in the works of Sachin Nayak, and let me just put out the reference too. Again, there was one work of mine, and Sachin Nayak, and I'm not able to read this here. Satpathy. And we did a comparison of his during the transit of Venus. He actually made an observation of the relative angular diameters of Venus and Sun. And how did he do this? He did not use telescope, so he may have had observatory under a tree, and but he made this, and it was quite accurate. He has given 1/32 as the ratio, and the ephemeris value actually gives it 1/30.9 or so. So he made this relative angular, but that was only one of the observations which he had. Number of remarkable observations and inferences which he had from that. So that's Samanta Chandrasekhar of Orissa, and yes. So I hope I'm not left out. Okay, you can see that there the Kodaikanal Observatory and the Begumpet Observatory, I have kept them as kind of epilogue, and I was not planning to really go into those because they move on into early 20th century. And a very well known Radha Govindachandra of Jessore, who did tremendous number of variable star observations. He also became a member of AAVSO, and so he contributed a lot of. Just think of it. I mean, for all of us, particularly those of us who have amateur telescopes and so on, here was someone at close of 19th century. Of course, most of his work was done early 20th century in the variable stars. He would have been very young in 19th century, but with the kind of simple equipment that he had access to, he submitted so many observations of variable stars. So that's something really, I mean, for us to ponder about, no? And then I come to an instrument maker from Lahore, and this was from Sri Ramula Sharma, work of his, that I got this information, and even this image of the astrolabe. He made several astrolabes, and both in the Arabic astrolabe in the school, and also Sanskrit astrolabes. He made a number of astrolabes. Now the thing is, Lahore is famous for astrolabes from very early, from times of Humayun, and perhaps even earlier, much earlier. But then the astrolabe making had come to a pause, and then it kind of restarted in the 19th century. So Gulmohar Lahori. He was one of them, and there was a mention in Professor S.R. Sharma's paper of a few other instrument makers, and so that's something still to be added in this map. And so that, I think, perhaps brings me to the close. So this was the kind of build up from Indian endeavors, and I'm sure this is very, very partial. There must be a lot more, and it will be great fun. I mean, very, very fruitful to try and find out what other efforts were with there. And then they led towards the end of it to such great projects as the Kodaikanal Solar Observatory, which kind of now is continuing to function into modern times, and has the kind of one of the longest surviving daily images of the sun and solar astrophysics. It's a uh, world class work in solar astrophysics continuing today. Then there was, I mean, this is the products of, I mean, of all these endeavors which had happened in the previous century. This was the Nizamaya Observatory, Begumpet, Hyderabad, which again, it of course fell into disuse later, but at that time when it was functioning, and this is not 19th century now, this is early 20th century, it was part of the Cartesian project of mapping the skies very, very finely, and so it made significant contributions to that. And I think there was so this is kind of I may have had left out here and there, but I see also that I have run into quite a lot of time. Perhaps, I mean, I will pause a little here and see if there are any questions and discussions. I hope um, this was Dipankar. I think I would like to pause a little here. Oh, sorry. I have this overlay continuously there, huh? Sorry, I didn't see when I was talking of all of that, when I talking of Kodaikanal and the Begumpet Observatory, when I was showing those, I didn't realize that I had an overlay which was not
Okay.
allowing it to be seen. So that's fine anyway. So because I was not planning to include these in the 19th century discussions, but just as a kind of culmination of these efforts. So the Kodaikanal Observatory and the Begumpet Cartesian project, which was the Begumpet Observatory. So I pause here, Dipankar.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, actually, I still not. I'm not seeing any question till now because it just was a wonderful storyline. It was just beautiful. And just walking through the 19th century astronomy and just like I'm listening to a story. So I think everyone just understood beautifully the rich history of astronomy in India and all the
Yeah.
works that have been done.
Yeah, I should have gone a little more into details of each of those observations. That would have also been interesting because I was jumping to so many places. I jumped out of a place very quickly. So, like for instance, I had wanted to read out a little bit of some of the works which observations of Ankitan Venkata Singh Rao. Right, he was one of the persons who actually had a number of publications out of his astronomical endeavors. But okay, wait, I'll have to pull that out.
Yes, ma'am.
So
Please continue.
I'm just looking up any, I mean, some of those, because I left out a little bit of actual details of the works which were done. So I was really struck by the lyrical language in which he had written out some of his observations. Unfortunately, I didn't make a slide of it, so I'm just trying to pull that out. But I hope, I mean, all of this, I did it more in a kind of a spirit of trying to get a feel for what was happening around in the country, and Indian endeavors in astronomy, what all were there. So that is how I had put that. So I hope that was of, I mean, some interest and use. Let me try to pull out one of his. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Uh, yes, his comet observations. So he talks of 1882, the comet 1882, and it's in the eastern heaven before sunrise, and it's conspicuous to the naked eye. It talks about bright planetary disk. He probably means that the coma part of it, surrounded by nebulosity, And then on applying higher magnification, this appearance vanishes and the center of the head is not occupied by a star-like point. The head has a border of light surrounding it on the side towards the sun. And so these are the word pictures which, I mean, whenever we are looking at historical papers, I find this really fascinating. And he has, of course, made measurement, quantitative measurement. Length of the bright part of the tail is between 7 to 8 degrees, and a narrow rays or streaks of light extending more than 12 degrees, and so on. Yeah, this is where he says that it's shaped like a tusk of an elephant, the thick part being at the greatest altitude. Uh, and then, yeah, he says observing the comet with the naked eye at the seaside, the whole tail took nearly an hour to rise. And so he talks about that. He also mentions a few of the boys who were observing there. So there in one of the papers there was a mention. One was his own son, A.V. Jaggarao, and another. So they were also the observers at that time. And he also mentions that the Panchangam predicted. So one doesn't know exactly the details of how the prediction was done, but there was that prediction of this. Then I'd like to talk a little bit about the eclipse observations of Narsingh Rao. Uh, this is a partial observation. Okay, this is the partial observation. He actually did for Mercury transit and for actually Venus transit. For Mercury transit he actually plotted. So where even that field rotation etc. is seen. He made a plot of its movement on the surface of the sun, and for Venus transit actually I did kind of a comparison with ephemeris of his timings and the observations which he had done. And mm, so these are some of the observations. So if there are yeah, maybe there are some questions. Okay, so Joseph is asking, do anybody in India discover the precision of Earth's axis of rotation? It must mean, and yes, in a sense that see, there were two Vedic mentions, which talked about Kritika at equator and the summer solstice sun being near a particular star. If the two independent mentions are looked at, they clearly show effect of precision. Uh, Although, I mean, these were just mentions at that time. And but later on, astronomers they did the corrections for this were incorporated time to time, and in fact this is emphasized in many instances, and also many people found that the discrepancy, like for instance the discrepancies which Jaising found or which Samanta Chandrasekhar found when applying the Siddhantic, let's say the framework of maybe Aryabhatta or Varamira, and then moving it forward to their contemporary times, the differences they found would have had included this the corrections or no, applied or not applied for precision. So it's not that this wasn't the INMs are corrections. Perhaps I'm not quite, I mean, expert in this, but these corrections were there. However, they may not have been as systematic as in Western astronomy. So that is one of the questions I saw. And okay, so if there aren't any other questions, uh, let me just this particular format in which I prepared the visuals makes it a little. If I had used a presentation, perhaps I would have had all the things which I wanted to talk about right in front of me. Uh, there was one other person I think who was there in the map, which was to do with who was teaching in Bethune College, and he was looking. In fact, he was looking at history of astronomy in India the way we are looking, and I have that in the map, which I had left out mentioning. Uh, Yes, and there are several other in Professor Ansari's papers here, and there are mentions of several other Zij works, Zij work ongoing into the 19th century. However, I could not find further information about it in terms of locating where the siege was from or further information, so I had not included that. So I think I will stop here then. Uh, though if some context comes up, I will try to pick up. As I was telling you, Dipankar, earlier,
Yes,
I
ma'am.
put together a whole lot of material. However, not all of it I have put in systematically enough that I am able to pull it out here at this stage.
So,
But there
that's
are many of the, particularly now, there is so much of this information which is there in the archive, a lot of information, for instance, of the Asiatic Review, Calcutta Review, and so on. But to pull out more information about this, a lot of content which I looked up there was from early, like late 18th century and early 19th century, where people were kind of Oriental scholars looking at ancient Indian astronomy. For instance, I mean, from the tables which, what's his name, Lee Gentil, the Tiruvallur tables, which he took back to France, which in fact started the whole look at, like how ancient is the astronomy of India in the West. So a lot of the work at that time I find is of this kind. But specific mentions of astronomy endeavors happening ongoing in 18th century, there is still, I think, a lot to pull out from these works. So anybody interested, it would be nice we could work together on this.
yes.
I hope it was of interest.
Of course, it was of interest, and just I have told you that it's more like a storyline, and just to keep the interest going in the field of astronomy, the future events or the present events observations are important, yes, but knowing the history, how it came to existence in our knowledge, so it is also important to know the history also, because history always teaches us very some interesting and important things all the time.
Yes,
So
it's very fascinating. It's really
so
fascinating.
So now I ask Shoikot sir to do the formal conclusion of this session of today. So it's such a beautiful session.
Thanks, Dipankar. And before thanking ma'am, I just want to say a couple of words. I just can't thank her. It's impossible on my part to thank her. The couple of words which I wanted to say was, especially this year, 2020, has taught us one thing. We should not take anything for granted. We do not have the option of taking anything for granted. Frankly speaking, let's ask ourselves, how many of us even thought of looking up these pages of Indian history of Indian astronomy? We didn't think of it even. And this lady, Dr. Ratnasri, placed before us a wonderful story, bringing up these jewels for us. What a fantastic story. I mean, it's very difficult to believe that she's a doctorate in theoretical physics, especially in stellar physics. And what a wonderful storyteller. Wonderful.
Because
Yes,
I picked up the
she
story.
walked us through time. She simply walked us through time. But this boils down to a single line that if you do not have that authority over the subject, you cannot tell it so simply. What a beautiful story. What Dipankar said correctly. This was not a science discussion. It was a story filled with
Yeah.
information. It truly took me back to my
I
childhood days.
I
Truly
borrowed
took me
from a
back.
lot of researchers, though. I borrowed
But ma'am,
all the
this was out
statistics.
of the world. This was out of the world. What a fantastic story. It was a storyline very lucidly presented, full of information, educative. Now, there were references to names or places we even never heard of. Yet, after he told us that, we came to know what fantastic contributions they have made. We can't even dream of those contributions using the modern day equipments. What they did was spectacular. What they did was mesmerizing. So simply you drew us into a web that you wove out of those things, of those facts and figures, and it was out of the world. After saying all this, I again say it's very difficult for me to thank you. But still, I have to do that. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you
I
very
thank
much.
you for giving me the opportunity. I thank
And
you.
the best part of it is the finishing part of your lecture, where you were not satisfied with the data you were sharing with us due to the shortage of time or due to whatever factors, which leaves you hungry as well as us, leaves us hungry even more, from which we can expect you again with us.
Yes, yes. I think we
Storylines
could
like
do
this.
an exploration with a little more of the science aspects in all this work, which
Definitely,
perhaps I
ma'am.
didn't touch upon as much. Huh?
That's the reason I asked for your time after the session. So, from everyone at Skywatch Association Kolkata, we heartily thank Dr. Ratnasri for her fabulous storyline of scientific facts on the history of Indian astronomy. At least I can say I have never looked at things in the way she showed us. Thank you, ma'am, once again. So, with this, before concluding, I'd like to add one point regarding our future programs. We have had a number of questions on telescopes. Basically, questions from amateurs. They have related telescope with observational astronomy. Though telescope forms a very small part of it. What telescope? What is a telescope? What telescope should I buy? What is the cost of a telescope? How is the telescope made? Where do we get to buy telescopes, etc., etc. So what we have decided is we'll be presenting a three-part presentation on telescopes basically. What are they? How many kinds we find? Which ones suit your budget as well as your lifestyle? Are you going to move around with it? If then, this is the type. Are you going to fix it onto your rooftop? If then, this is the type. So these questions will be addressed. These are the majority types of questions we receive, and we'll be presenting a 3 to 4 part presentation on telescopes, which will start with what is a telescope and will end with where do you get to buy them, what are the costs as on that date. So we have plenty of questions with us. In addition to it, we request all of you to send in whatever queries, may it be anything wild, anything foolish you think of. Send us your queries regarding telescopes. We'll try to answer all of those in those 3 or 4 presentations. With this note and looking forward to working together, I call it a day. Thank you very
Sir,
much for being with us.
Yeah,
sir,
there is a
before the
question.
conclusion, there is a question.
Oh,
Hmm.
great.
Huh. So, whether women astronomers felt any kind of, social disturbance for loving astronomy in that time? Now, I talked about Bacha Begum, and she definitely had, from her learning and so on, she had an interest in it. And however, she did not get an opportunity to, that was there for at that time for women. It would not have had, it was a kind of a background role only that they could play. So she did not get the opportunity to really move forward with through her interest. Then I mentioned also about Ankita Machutama, and she was the daughter of Jaggarao. So she may have had inherited an interest in astronomy, and her husband was an active astronomer. After his death, she tried to keep up the work of the observatory. So it may partly have had been her own intrinsic interest, and also a kind of a sense of duty which the family was showing towards all of these works in any case. So she did have at that time enough facilitation in her hand, and then when it was handed over to the government observatory and so on, so maybe she did not have that much of a discrimination. But and then we have to find out whether there were other people. We do not have right now, further information about it, but it will be very interesting exploration to do. How many more Bacha Begums may have had been there who were interested but did not get that opportunity?
So,
And
Dipankar, I think we do not have any more questions. Anyway, we are keeping this session alive. Any questions on these, please send it to us. We will send it to Dr. Ratnasri and she'll be happy to answer those. We'll mail it to her. If you have any questions in the coming days, please mail it to us or post it on the link we have sent. With that note, thank you everyone. And ma'am, thank you once again. A very hearty
thank
thanks from
you.
once again. And this is not the end. We expect you to be with us for several times in future. Not
Yes,
once,
yes,
but several times.
yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.